Okay.
It's Hannah in New York.
Hannah's in New York. She has class
She
for
just for architecture.
yeah, she got
PhD.
she got accepted to a master's in architecture in New York. And then there's another, she also applied to so we're still deciding.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you would be better. So you can stay.
I can stay there. Hi, welcome, come on.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I don't want to influence me, right?
No. All right, get started in just a second. Yes, yeah, it's been both already.
Is there anyone sitting there? Oh, maybe I should get close.
Go ahead.
Sit here.
You can start the introduction.
Yeah. So for everybody should probably know me, but I'm Dan Frolich. I'm a PhD student here at FIU, studying transportation engineering. The focus of my dissertation is micromobility. I want to start off by thanking the committee, Dr. Hadi, Dr. Gunn, Dr. Alluri, Dr. Garza, and Dr. Go for your advice and your help developing this dissertation. And obviously, I'd like to thank Dr. Jin very much for all her advice and her guidance. Thank you all for coming and showing up to it's going to be hopefully an interesting presentation for everybody. I'd also like to thank my parents for helping set up the food and everything here. All right. So I
Oh, oh.
1, 2, 3. Forgot Dr. Go is not here.
Dr. Go is online. Okay. All right. So yep. So my dissertation is the micromobility revolution, attitudinal and environmental factors that affect micromobility adoption. We're going to go over some introduction and background, overview of what micromobility is, the importance and of prioritizing capital improvement projects for micromobility, some of the research goals and objectives for my dissertation, the challenges in the current micromobility infrastructure and the gap in infrastructure quality in the US. Then we're going to go over the current research policy and other aspects of micromobility through the literature review that I conducted. Then we're going to go over the main data sources and preliminary statistical analysis I did for my dissertation. And then we're going to go over the 3 main objectives, which are micromobility attitudes, the built environment, and micromobility, and then the final framework for prioritizing micromobility. And then we're going to go over overall conclusions and policy recommendations. So getting started, introduction and background. Some of you might not even know what micromobility is. So micromobility is an emerging travel mode that uses small personal vehicles such as bikes, e-bikes, and e-scooters to get around. The earliest type of micromobility is the humble bicycle. It's a more recent invention than most would think. You know, you think it'd be easy to have two wheels connected, but it was only invented in 1817 by Carl van Drijf. And then it took until the 1880s to get the modern safety bicycle, is what it was called back then, which is the modern bicycle, pedal and chain. And that's when, in the 1890s, it took off with mass production and had widespread use as a form of transportation. Then in the 20th century, we had other forms of transportation get more of a highlight. But now, starting in the 2010s, we've seen the emergence of electric micromobility vehicles as a new trend in especially urban transportation. Some more interesting facts that people might not realize is that even today, bikes outsell cars by volume. So in 2024, there were around 130 million bicycles sold worldwide, as compared to around 57.6 million internal combustion engine vehicles. E-bikes were also a major growth. Around 60 million e-bikes were sold worldwide in 2024. And then compared to electric vehicles, you can see there were only 17 million electric vehicles. So e-bikes are not only greater in volume than electric vehicles, but they're also a greater proportion of total bike sales. That shows that the electric revolution is more underway in the micromobility space than even in the combustion engine vehicle space. However, in North America, we don't use micromobility or public transport very much. This is a study that I saw in my research. It's called the ABCs of Mobility, and it highlights the extreme dependence on car usage in cities across the USA and Canada. The main highlight I wanted to point out from the study is this graphic that they created, where they looked at commute modes in around 800 cities, and they plotted it in this map on this graph that has car usage, public transport usage, and active mobility. The closer you are to C here in the corner, the closer you are to everyone drives. A is everyone walks or cycles, and B is everyone uses public transport. The blue dots represent the USA and Canada, and you can see they all cluster in this little corner here, close to everyone drives. Even cities that we consider more walkable, more public transit oriented, such as New York City, are still very close to that corner of everyone drives, as compared to the rest of the world, where there's a much greater mix of different forms of transportation. This indicates our severe over-reliance on cars and the marginal use of public transport and active mobility. And like I said, in contrast, the rest of the world has a much greater diversity in forms of transport. I will say there's some trends are improving in the United States. So this is from the National Association of City Transport Officials Shared Micromobility in 2023. And you can see the rapid increase in shared micromobility across the United States, especially starting in 2018, 2019, when we started to get these dockless micromobility solutions. Micromobility comes with a lot of benefits. So one is congestion relief. Inherently, these vehicles are smaller than traditional vehicles, and they can have greater capacity and are more efficient of space in urban environments. They have much lesser environmental impacts, which are greenhouse gas emissions. They provide greater accessibility. You're able to continue using these modes into old age, and obviously younger people can still use these modes, so they're more accessible to different groups of people. They're more equitable. They're more financially accessible, so they provide a lower cost alternative to the personal vehicle, and they promote well-being, right? If you incorporate that active mobility into your everyday life, you're incorporating exercise, you're incorporating. There's been some interesting demographic and attitudinal changes in the US that point to micromobility also having great benefits. On the younger generation side, we've seen younger people delaying or foregoing obtaining driver's license. So you can see here, this is a graph of the share of the population aged 16 to 19 that are licensed drivers, and it's been going down. So people are getting their licenses later in life.
In the US?
In the US, yeah. And there's been an increased demand for dense urban housing and city center living. On the other side of the coin, for aging populations, we've seen the necessity to find other modes of transportation as people get older and they can no longer drive. So some of these retirement communities that are incorporating micromobility as a solution to that. So this is from the Villages, Florida. They have an extensive micromobility network that enables the elderly to still have mobility and independence long after they're no longer able to drive. In this case, they actually use golf carts throughout the entire system. So that's pretty cool. I wanted to highlight some example success stories with micromobility. So internationally, we have the Netherlands as the gold standard for bike infrastructure. Bogota, Colombia gets 800,000 daily cyclists. Paris, France has seen a rapid transformation over the past few years into a very cyclist-friendly city. Domestically, there's even some examples. Davis, California has over a 15% bicycle commute share. In our backyard here in Key West, we have also around 15% bicycle commute share. Other cities, Peachtree, Georgia is a really cool example where a lot of their residents get around, even the high schoolers all get around on golf carts on an independent micromobility system. And then in South Florida, we even have an example, which is Miami Beach, which 5% is not nothing, let's just put it that way, but it's been recognized for bike friendliness by the League of American Cyclists. So why did I want to focus on South Florida? Well, first of all, this is where I grew up, this is where I live. And beyond that, I think it provides a lot of interesting potential. First of all, the urban landscape got a sprawling urban environment with diverse transportation needs, had rapid population growth. It has lots of transportation challenges, as many of you know, with severe traffic congestion, limited public transportation, and environmental concerns. Another interesting aspect here is that vehicle miles traveled in South Florida have increased faster than the population growth. So even though we've gotten more population, our vehicle miles traveled have increased even more than that. And beyond that, transit ridership has also increased or recovered from a pre-pandemic level to a greater extent here in South Florida than it has in other parts of the country, which I think is really interesting. And it shows just the sheer demand for various forms of transportation and the need for that innovation in our transportation system. So based on that, I wanted to go over what are the actual goals and objectives for my dissertation and what are the challenges in our current micromobility infrastructure and what is that gap in the infrastructure quality in the US. So some of the challenges for micromobility are the lackluster infrastructure. This is right here in our backyard here on 8th Street. So you can see all we have is a lackluster painted bike lanes. This is a common sight all over the United States. This is not the type of micromobility infrastructure that's going to drive people to adopt it. We have sprawling suburban low density developments, separation of land uses through Euclidean zoning, and the branching structure of our suburban street networks. How can we address these challenges? So that was the next step that I thought. What can we as transportation engineers do to address these challenges in infrastructure? Well, first of all, we can start to prioritize which corridors will maximize ridership if we properly invest in them. We can start incorporating micromobility into the design standards. We can strategically select corridors to promote sustainable transportation. And then we can integrate that with our existing transportation networks, such as our mass transit network. So that brings me to the overall goal. The goal of the study is to develop a framework that integrates adoption behavior and spatial demand, identify the priority locations for micromobility corridors. And it does this using 3 main objectives. The first objective is to understand the types of people that are willing to switch to micromobility. So the purpose is to investigate why individuals would switch from typical travel modes to micromobility. And the general hypothesis is that people are people, lower travel time and cost are the most influential than any specific mode of preference. The focus of this study was to assess general attitudes toward micromobility and understand the factors that influence mode choice. And then the goal is to identify who are those enthusiastic micromobility users and understand what are their attitudes and preferences. The second objective was to analyze the built environment's effect on micromobility volume. So before we were looking at who is willing to use micromobility, and here we're kind of looking at who actually uses micromobility. The purpose here is to quantify how the built environment characteristics influence observed micromobility ridership at the corridor level. The focus is to develop corridor level estimates of micromobility volume, integrating various data sources, and model the relationship between the built environment and those existing ridership paths. And the goal is to identify which of those built environment characteristics are associated with higher micromobility usage. And then finally, the third objective is to bring the previous two together and build that framework for prioritizing micromobility corridors. The purpose here is to develop a unified framework that integrates the behavioral adoption and the observed micromobility ridership to prioritize corridor level investment. The focus is to incorporate the demand side, the willingness to adopt, and the supply side, the infrastructure and the land use, and create a framework that can actually be used for planning applications. The goals, we want to identify the corridors that maximize micromobility volume, ensure that they're distributed equitably, and provide that guide for policymakers to prioritize micromobility enhancement. So the next step in my process was to look at the current research policy and other aspects of micromobility, see what has been studied before and what is most important for micromobility. And what I found were three main research categories in the literature. First, adoption factors, current reasons why people choose micromobility. Second was the built environment. And third was transportation equity. So those were kind of the three overall research categories. But then diving deeper, among each of them, there were some various themes that I broke the literature down into. So in terms of adoption factors, some of the papers focused on the infrastructure and the user experience. So how does dedicated bike lanes, how does where there's micromobility storage locations, those types of things, how do they impact adoption of micromobility? Other studies looked at the regulatory framework. So where is shared micromobility allowed to exist? Where does, how does that influence the public perception of micromobility? Others did more geospatial analysis, looking at service coverage, high use corridors, the influence of population density, land use, and other operational dynamics. Other studies looked at socioeconomic and demographic influences, so the typical income, age, gender, other cultural factors. And then finally, others looked at user experience and perceptions, especially with shared micromobility. There's a challenge of using the digital technology to unlock that shared micromobility scooter. On the other side, built environment factors. The studies generally looked at infrastructure and accessibility. So again, infrastructure comes back. What is the impact of bike lanes, paths, and parking on usage? And they highlighted the importance of a well-connected cycling network. Safety came up a lot in the built environment. A lot of studies on road design, traffic speed, physical barrier, and the role of protected bike lanes. And then land use and destination access. So how many things can you get to using micromobility? And finally, in terms of equity, there were three main themes. One was accessibility and distribution. So where are these micromobility services available? Where is the infrastructure actually put into place? There was also highlighted the gender imbalance. Men are more likely to use micromobility. There's a highlight of the affordability aspect of it, especially for shared micromobility. It can be a challenge for low-cost individuals to afford. And then social and environmental justice was another equity study that was, a lot of studies looked at inclusivity and the environmental benefits of micromobility. So based on those three main types of papers, I know this is really tiny. I looked at all of the the key factors from the literature review to try to figure out what could I investigate in order to come up with an overall framework. So I broke it down by each of those types of papers and what actual metrics did they study. And with that, that inspired the data that I wanted to choose for my paper. So that's what we're going to go over now. So for my dissertation, there were a few main data sources. For objective one, the main data source was a survey. It was conducted among micromobility users in South Florida. For objective two, there were two main types of data. One is that land use data, which came from the smart location database, and zoning data from municipal and county sources. And then for micromobility volume, I used bike count estimates from Strava and FDOT bike counters. And then finally, for developing the framework, we have a few maps of the existing infrastructure that were used. So for objective one, for the survey data, the survey aimed to understand why people would switch from typical travel modes to micromobility by analyzing their different attitudes, socioeconomic, and demographic variables. The survey was conducted online in South Florida. There were some mode-specific questions. So for people that said they had used transit, e-scooter, or moped, we wanted to know what their service satisfaction and attitudes towards each mode. And then the main core part of the survey was a stated preference scenario where respondents gave us an example trip that they had done, and they were asked to compare that to that same trip if it were to be done by e-scooter or e-scooter plus transit, and see would they be willing to switch. So what that looked like is something like this, where respondents, after telling us about their example trip, were given these scenarios and were asked to choose which of these scenarios were to choose. And they were given a few different scenarios until we could try to figure out what their priorities were. So some of the interesting findings, just analytically looking at the survey data, we saw an interesting difference between users of Uber, e-scooters, and transit. We saw that e-scooter users were more frequent. So they use it around 3 to 4 times per week the most, whereas Uber had more occasional use, and transit was in the middle. In terms of attitudes, respondents were asked what's most important in selecting their mode of travel. Environmental impact was toward the bottom, and reliability and safety were most important to respondents. So coming back, infrastructure, safety, that's important if you want people to use micromobility. In terms of lifestyle, we saw that there was a strong preference for ownership. Respondents said they definitely want to own a car and that they would rather own than rent things. Another interesting question that had some interesting results was the reasons why respondents gave for why they don't use e-scooters. So they were essentially asked, when given the opportunity to use e-scooters, but you didn't use them, why was that? And this was split into those who frequently consider using e-scooters and those who rarely consider using e-scooters. What was found is those who frequently considered using e-scooters were a lot more likely to cite expense as the reason that they didn't end up using. So that was an interesting difference between the two of them. Among those that did actually use e-scooters, there were also some interesting properties. We saw that, again, that ownership comes back. E-scooter riders who don't own their own plan to purchase one. So if they had just been using shared e-scooters, they plan to purchase their own. Most riders frequently use e-scooter as a last mile connection. So that highlights the importance of connecting micromobility with transit. And then helmet usage remains a problem, up to a third saying they rarely or never use helmets while riding e-scooters. So the key takeaways for the data for objective one is that walking and personal vehicles dominate, even though e-scooters are gaining popularity. Safety is a top priority. E-scooters are a potential solution to the last mile problem of accessing transit. There's a strong emphasis on ownership, and then helmet usage was very important. So now we go on to objective 2, the land use data part of objective 2. So for land use, we had county and municipal zoning, which was spatially summarized into transportation analysis zones, TAZs. And then the built environment had the EPA smart location database, as well as the ACS longitudinal employer household dynamics survey for population density and work characteristics. Zoning, the land use data had to be aggregated by municipality because the county is complicated, and these municipalities had to code it all over, and these had to be aggregated and standardized to what the county zone looks like. So that was actually quite a bit of a challenge. These are just some example statistics from the ACS data, overall mean standard deviation for Miami County. Then we move on to the other data source for objective 2, which is the micromobility count data, where we had 2 main data sources. One is FDOD traffic counters. These provide pedestrian and bike counts for specific locations. And then the other data source that I found that was very helpful was Strava. I don't know if you guys know, it's an exercise app where you can record your runs, your different types of athletic trips. And this is essential because they provide network level data for those bike trips. Then the goal was to combine the Strava data with the FDOT data to combine the best of both worlds, right? So the problem with the Strava data is it only counts recreational trips. The problem with the FDOT data is it's not widespread, doesn't have GPS level corridor by corridor counts. And so what we can do is we can take the accurate FDOT data and adjust the Strava data to have an accurate overall picture of what at a corridor level the ridership is. And then accessing the data, Strava data is publicly available, and FDOT count data can be individually downloaded by station. This is what the heat map looked like on the Strava side. These are what the bike counter locations they actually record. This is really cool. They record individual trajectories and more detailed data, but I just use the overall counts. So this is what it looks like after adjusting for the FDOT bike counts. You can see there's a lot more ridership occurring outside of the common recreational areas. And then that was spatialized into bicycle miles traveled per acre to compare to other data sources. Actually, you can see that the majority of the bicycle miles traveled are in that urban core where there's just easier access to different population density, employment, all those types of things. Some interesting correlates that I did while exploring the spatial data. I compared bicycle miles traveled versus auto ownership rates, and we see kind of like 3 main areas. One is in the urban core, we have high bicycle miles traveled and low car ownership. Then in the suburbs, kind of outside, you have mostly high auto ownership rates, but low bicycle miles traveled. But then there is kind of an interesting South Florida area where you have both high auto ownership and high bicycle miles traveled. Contrastingly, walkability, this is from the the ACS survey. You have that same idea in the urban core, high walkability, high bicycle miles traveled. But then there's lots of other areas that have lots of walkability and low bicycle miles traveled, but the only places that have high bikeability is that same South Florida area, which I thought was interesting. So overall, the hypothesis for objective 2 was that land use significantly influences micromobility ridership, and that the built environment impacts the utilization patterns. And the key takeaways from that initial analysis is that high vehicle ownership rates lead to lower micromobility usage, and increased walkability leads to higher micromobility usage, which makes sense. And finally, for objective 3, this was used to build the framework. These are the existing infrastructure. Miami County has its idea of what the existing infrastructure is, and FDOT has a different idea. And those were taken into account in building the framework. So now we're going to go into the statistical analysis that was used to determine which of these factors were most important. For starting with objective 1, micromobility attitudes. For modeling attitudes, the model choice was a mixed logic model, and it was chosen for its ability to handle panel data and address limitations of a standard logic model. Utility, it has utility components, which is composed by both deterministic and stochastic parts. The time and cost were chosen as the random parameters to show variation and ensure clear results. This is because these were the most important factors. The benefit of the mixed logic model was that it captures heterogeneity really well. And beyond the mixed logic model, we also looked at interaction effects because, again, of the effect of time and cost. To bring out the other variables, we had to look at interaction effects between time and cost and the choice to use these groupers. So here are some of the key results. So one, again, as I've mentioned, travel time and cost were the strongest determinants for micromobility adoption. We saw that younger individuals are significantly more likely to adopt micromobility, while older groups showed a lot more resistance. We saw positive attitudes towards micromobility and infrastructure increase the likelihood of adoption. So people that said they like micromobility had a higher chance of adopting micromobility. And then pro-car attitudes reduced the probability of switching to micromobility. And the last thing we saw was that lower and middle income individuals are more likely to adopt micromobility than higher income. So these were interesting results. The conclusions, again, travel time and cost dominate mode choice. Attitudinal factors significantly influence behavior. Behavior willingness must be incorporated into planning decisions. So taking that willingness of people into the planning decisions. Build the micromobility where people will actually use it. The adoption potential varies systematically across different demographic groups. We saw that income and age were those heterogeneities in the demand. And car dependence still remains a key structural barrier. Then moving on, for objective 2, we looked at land use and micromobility. In this case, it was sufficient to use a simple ordinary least squares regression model to model micromobility ridership versus those other characteristics. In this case, ridership was the dependent variable measured in bicycle mile travels per acre. Various predictive variables were used, including density, land use, connectivity, transit access, infrastructure, and the coefficient indicate how each of those built environment variables is associated with ridership. So some key results. Higher density and more connected areas have greater micromobility ridership. Makes sense. Transit rider service and bus stop access were positively associated with ridership. Mixed use activity, especially retail and office density, supported micromobility ridership. Car ownership is associated with lower usage. And the overall result is that the built environment does play a major role in shaping where ridership is concentrated. So some of the conclusions from objective 2. Ridership is highest in dense, walkable, mixed-use, transit-accessible areas. Auto-oriented environments suppress micromobility usage. Spatial and statistical analysis can point to clear priority areas for investment. Equity remains a major consideration in planning those corridors. And the overall conclusion is that the built environment can be used to guide corridor-level micromobility prioritization. So if you look at the main results from objective 1 and objective 2, it shows a clear indication. Both the individual attitudes of people and the factors in the built environment are important for who will actually end up using a micromobility corridor. So that gets us to objective 3, which is to incorporate the knowledge and the ideas from the previous 2 objectives to develop that framework to prioritize and select micromobility corridors for improvement. So starting off, developing this framework, I wanted to choose some of the priorities that would be important when developing. And what I found were these were the 6 major things to look out for: population density, demographic information, socioeconomic status, land use, transit, and current ridership. So building on that, I wanted to give you guys an overview of the framework at a high level. The first component of the framework is a demand assessment. We want to evaluate the current and potential micromobility demand through data on demographics, land use, and travel patterns. So that's kind of combining objective 1 and objective 2 to find where is that demand right now. The second is a supply assessment. Analyze the existing infrastructure quality, including connectivity and safety, figure out where there's a lack of supply of infrastructure. And then if you combine those two, you can create a prioritization and scoring framework, which uses a multi-criteria decision-making process to score and rank those corridors based on factors like demand, potential, safety, connectivity, and equity. And then you can take that and start that stakeholder and community engagement to make sure you're meeting community-specific needs. And at the end, you have the implementation and monitoring phase, which provides municipalities with guidance on building those pilot projects and seeing, okay, I built this, does it actually bring more ridership? So for the demand side data sources, some of those data sources could be demographics, land use characteristics, micromobility usage, transit accessibility. For the supply side, infrastructure, roadway connectivity, level of traffic stress, and safety. Those are some of the supply side data sources. And that gives us the final theoretical framework, which I'll walk you guys through very quickly. First, you want to define the goals and objectives, just like we did at the beginning. What's important when you're trying to develop your micromobility network? Because that will guide you to what are the key criteria that you find important. Then you can go back to those example data sources and gather the available demand data, gather the available supply data, normalize and integrate that data until you have a supply score and a demand score on a corridor level basis. And then for each corridor, you can then calculate a gap score. So that gap score tells you what is the gap here between the potential for micromobility users and the existing supply of that infrastructure. And then this is where you refine that gap score. You rank those corridors by the gap score, incorporate any additional criteria, gather stakeholder feedback, and refine it until you have a final priority list, which you can then develop an implementation plan for, implement the pilot projects, and then again, you monitor performance and restart the cycle all over again. So that brings me to the overall conclusion, policy recommendations, and takeaways. The overall conclusions: behavior and adoption. Again, we come back to the same theme: travel time, cost, and safety are the drivers of micromobility adoption. Many travelers show a latent willingness to switch when the service is competitive. So that means there's not inherent people that are car drivers, inherent people that are micromobility users. People are willing to switch if the service is competitive, and that still there is some factor, which is that people's willingness should still be incorporated into those planning decisions because there is still some heterogeneity there. Second of all, for the built environment of ridership, ridership is highest in dense, mixed-use, connected transit accessible areas. Conversely, auto-oriented and low-density areas suppress micromobility usage. But the overall conclusion is that the built environment does shape where micromobility can realistically scale. And finally, from the framework, we learned that corridor prioritization should integrate both behavioral and spatial evidence. The greatest opportunities are where improvements can unlock latent demand, and that equity needs to be embedded in the selection process, not just an addendum, not just a passing mention, but actually embedded in the prioritization of which network, which corridor should be prioritized. So finally, I wanted to get into why is all of this relevant? So going back to the theme from the beginning, we have changes in our urban transportation systems. We've seen growing congestion and housing prices and housing pressure in especially South Florida, but throughout the major metropolitan areas of the US. We've seen more diverse travel patterns beyond just peak commuting as people maybe work from home and just a change in that peak commuting direction travel pattern. And micromobility fits these needs very well. As opposed to transit, it's very flexible, it's point to point. It supports a sustainable and lower impact mobility, and it addresses that congestion problem. It also enables you to build more dense housing because you don't have that concern of parking, of more traffic if people are using micromobility. And then the biggest relevance for my dissertation itself is that the current planning process is often fragmented. The infrastructure is disjointed, right? You have different municipalities trying different experiments. Usually, I like to think of it as just the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's wherever advocates are most strong, that's where the corridor gets built, but that's not going to lead to the greatest ridership and the greatest use. And especially, it will not lead to the greatest equity of distribution of those investments. And so we need at a regional basis to have those investments tied to ridership and mobility. So how does this dissertation contribute to those goals? First of all, it explains who will adopt micromobility. It shows that travel time and cost and safety are the main things that influence willingness to switch. And it shows that preferences do vary across individuals. It explains where demand is highest by connecting observed micromobility usage to land use. And it identifies the built environment conditions linked to that increased demand so that we can actually start prioritizing the correct corridors. And then finally, it gives agencies a way to act on this evidence. It supports a strategic and less fragmented infrastructure investment, starting to create a process to actually select the corridors that will build the most micromobility ridership. Some of the limitations of this research: stated preference data always has limitations. People will state one thing and then do another. It's the spatial analysis specific to South Florida. South Florida is an interesting environment to study, but it is definitely different in other urban contexts throughout the US. The infrastructure and land use data set availability is a challenge. Just building that land use data set was a challenge. And then the biggest, I would say, limitation is that the prioritization framework is analytical rather than fully implemented. And there might be a lot of real world challenges when we actually do it with the agency and look at the local constraints and the field validation of the proposed framework. So future research could focus on other regions, testing the framework in metropolitan areas with different land use patterns, transit systems, and contexts. Doing the longitudinal analysis, I only measured essentially one point in time, but these changes in ridership are occurring continuously as our infrastructure and urban conditions evolve. We want to look at more network integration. So we saw the importance of micromobility as that first and last mile option. And so capturing that connectivity between micromobility and transit and pedestrian networks would be another really great area for future research. And then finally, applying the framework in practice by incorporating real world planning, funding, and decision-making constraints would lead to a lot of new insights. And so I wanted to essentially end this presentation on what I would say is the favorite quote from my dissertation, which is, this dissertation demonstrates that micromobility adoption is not constrained by a lack of user willingness, but by the spatial, infrastructural, and institutional context in which travel decisions are made. And I have one more section for you guys. One last thing. I like to call this my qualitative research. And that's because micromobility is not just what I study. I like to say it's what I live. I have various forms of micromobility that I take. I like to participate in critical mass, which is like a group ride that goes throughout whenever I'm at a different city. Oh yeah, it's if you guys want to go, it's tomorrow. Tomorrow afternoon. I like to ride with friends. That's friends who have a tandem bike. I have my cargo bike. It's great for shopping. It's about the same size as um, some other clicks. I've always some of the greatest anecdotes I have is that even in places like FIU, where you wouldn't expect micromobility to be very successful, I've told people you can bike to main campus and back much faster than you can drive there, park, get to your destination, go up 5 floors of the parking garage to go back down. And people are always surprised that, oh, you have class at main campus in 10 minutes and you haven't left here yet? Yeah, I can just go directly on micromobility. I've had lots of great experiences showing how far you can actually take micromobility. This is in New York, planting some flowers and going to Home Depot and picking them up. And that's how, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience, from Zoom? I hope you guys,
I have some questions.
yes.
I have some questions on the objective one.
Okay.
When you did the survey, how many survey that you collect?
We had 400 final respondents after 408 respondents after cleaning and
Oh, yes.
sorting the data. So I think the overall respondent pool was over 1,000, but then after filtering out responses, you know how people reply to online surveys, it was 400.
And you collect online.
Yes,
You can
online.
take the link.
Yeah, so we use the survey research partner, Qualtrics, and they have their panel of respondents that they reach out to. And then that also lets us ensure that we're hitting all the different demographics and having a mix of incomes, ages, demographics, educational attainment levels that we standardize for. So
Yeah, that's a question. How could you make sure that your the group of your survey can represent the population of Southern? What parameter that you use to control your survey data, like the age, the proportion of age on income, or the location of living?
So yeah, those were we focused on South Florida for the survey, and exactly what you mentioned. We had age as a controlling factor, race, educational attainment, and geographic distribution. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And then I have not a question, but like a suggestion that would be interesting. I think if you include the seasoning data into your research, it would be interesting because like winter and summer is totally different because summer is the weather is unpredictable. People may not like to use the micro building, right? The rainy, the storm,
Yeah, definitely. In South Florida, we have summer is as the season not to use, whereas up north it's the opposite. Winter, I will say, my micromobility usage. I live in New York now, was heavily reduced by the winter storms that we had.
That's
Thank you.
great.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I just wonder on the last part you were saying about, I guess the idea of regional partnerships and planning, like how would you foresee something like that to be able to emerge? Because everyone, like you were saying, the squeaky wheel.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like people are doing what they want to do, but I don't foresee a solution or.
We do have regional planning organizations. We have at the county level our MPOs, or Miami-Dade County has TPO, and they do some of that regional power planning. But I think it needs to be emphasized and given more power.
Yeah, because the
essentially,
city planner would be
because-
like, no, I'm doing my own thing.
Yeah, the TPO or the MPO can suggest that these are the corridors that are important, but it's up to actually showing why they're important and why the various municipalities and more local governments should adopt a regional plan for micromobility and show the benefits to actually get to that level.
And that's, in that case, would you use your framework as some kind of rating scale for different solutions across regionally that kind of harmonize together in some coherent consideration for
Right.
everyone?
So that's the end product of the framework, right? It's a list of which of the corridors are most important to prioritize at a regional basis, but still incorporating the local context and local needs and local stakeholders.
Yeah, I just still think it's a challenge reach, right? Because even region, how is that defined? Because eventually
Yeah,
it's like not multi-state or
yeah.
national or, yeah, I don't know.
I think for micromobility, it's a very rare user that's going to go more than a few miles. So I would say regional planning, but understanding the conditions that foster micromobility.
I see. Yeah. So with that, then I know you mentioned high density promotes
Mhm.
micro mobility. So I just, in my mind, I was just picturing like what you just like New York, right, where the
Mhm.
skyscrapers, they can increase the density and so is that kind of, is that what you're suggesting in this situation? More skyscrapers, so to speak?
So it's a combination. I think we saw some of the examples are not necessarily the skyscraper cities, right? We saw Davis, California is not Manhattan, right? Key West is also not Manhattan. Micromobility can succeed in environments outside of the super dense. If you build infrastructure for it and if you prioritize it correctly. Micromobility can help to enable greater growth in verticality by limiting the externalities caused by people moving in, right? Main complaint when you have more residents is where's the parking? But if those residents are not consuming our road resources to the same extent, then it's more palatable to have people living with it. So I would say it's both, right? It encourages more development and it can be built with the current level of development in a lot of places like South Florida.
During your research, at any point, did you think it'd be interesting to include the waterways or like mobility across water?
That could be an interesting one.
Just the interesting environment we're in.
That's do jet skis count as micromobility?
Yeah,
That's a real question.
Right.
I'll leave that for future researchers to determine.
Right.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Don't be shy.
The last chance.
Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
Hi, it's a really great presentation. I have a small question that you mentioned you used EPA data, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, what type of data is it accessibility data?
So this is the spatial land use data. So it includes kind of network connectivity, different types of land use, and overall walkability. Yeah.
So that is National Walkability Index, right?
Yes, it's available at a national level, but then I only took the subset that is South Florida.
Okay, and the data is, I mean, based on which year in 2000, which year you collected for 2000?
Is I believe what
Okay.
because that corresponded to the same availability for FDOT's bike counters and for Strava data availability. The Strava data, they have it available, but not the most current. So when I was doing this analysis, 2023 was the most current available data.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks. Thank you, Mamoon. Any other questions from the Zoom? I don't mean to ignore you guys.
If we have time, I have more questions.
Dr. Jim, what time do we have?
I think
A few more minutes.
Oh, yeah, okay. Go back to the objective one again, when you analyze your data. I just want to know that, did you analyze the correlation and multicollinearity of your parameter?
Yes, so that was analyzed using the interaction effects. Like I mentioned, because time and cost were such dominant variables,
Yeah.
in order to bring out the heterogeneity in the other variables, we did the interaction effects to deal with the multicollinearity between time and cost and the other parameters to figure out which of those are actually important and which of those are just correlated with time and cost.
But you include all parameters in your form.
I did the type of analysis where you take all of them and you optimize the model by removing variables until you get the more optimized model. Yeah.
One more question.
Thank you all. Now we ask the students and parents who leave the room. The committee will ask more questions.
Awesome. I think that we could have afterwards, but people are going away.
So come back.
We'll come down and serve them and then.
Yeah.
Yeah, that works.
Now.
Depends. We don't know. Yeah, we have 1 more hour
it
left.
could be 2 hours.
Oh, no worries. Oh, no.
Hi. Thank you guys on Zoom for joining. Really appreciate it. I would ask now that anybody who is not on the committee, please leave the Zoom.
Okay.
I have to kick people out.
There's still some people online.
Let me stop the recording.